Well, that was stressful. India and Pakistan just fought in the hottest crisis between the two since 1971. The two exchanged missiles targeting each other's air bases and other military facilities, and their armies fought along the line of control for several days. And then suddenly, it all just stopped. A ceasefire was agreed to between the two, and that halted the fighting. Well, not all the fighting, but we're going to talk about that. Since then, it has mostly held firm. But what really happened during this conflict, and can we even assign winners and losers to this, and if so, who are they? And why does this conflict matter to anybody, especially you if you are an American like I am? Let's discuss all of this in this video. We're going to go in depth on this crisis and what really happened. We're going to discuss why and how this conflict escalated so quickly, and then how the ceasefire ultimately came into place. We're also going to discuss whether or not this really is the end of the conflict or just a waiting period for something worse, and who won this round. With all that, let's get started. But before we do all that, there's a word from today's video sponsor, and that's me. I'm launching a Patreon to support this channel. This will help me to pay for video editing and other key capabilities that help me to grow the quality of these videos and potentially one day the quantity of these videos. And because of that, I'm not going to ask for donations here. And yes, I do have a Buy Me a Coffee if that's interesting to you. I don't market that because I would rather just provide some sort of additional service in return for your support. And that's all in addition to the free YouTube content that I'm making here right now. This, of course, takes me to the Patreon, where my members will receive weekly intelligence reports made by me on the top 5 international stories from the previous week. The analyst tier will receive this report, as well as receiving access to my videos early and weekly recognition at the end of every video. The senior analyst tier will receive all of those benefits, and they will also receive a monthly priority topic request that will be covered in greater depth in the following weekly report. So if you are somebody that's planning to travel somewhere and you want to know about the security situation in that place, or you have a business interest somewhere, or you're just curious about something, you can pop that question or that topic request into the membership. I'll do some research on it and I will present it in the next report for the group. I'll probably be adding more features to this in the future as we move along, but this is what I'm starting with right now. New analyst members will receive their first 7 days for free, so you can kind of see what we've got going so far and see if this is something that you're interested in before you actually commit. Check the link to the Patreon down in the video description for more. With all that, back to the video. The conflict between India and Pakistan that just kicked off marks one of the most intense escalations between two nuclear-armed powers that has ever happened directly since the nuclear age. Since the dropping of bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no two nuclear powers have directly fought each other in a conflict. They usually fight each other through proxies. However, this is a different situation. Both India and Pakistan are nuclear powers, and they're not fighting through proxies. They're fighting each other directly. And not only that, this is the highest intensity of fighting that we have seen between the two since their last war in 1971. Now, the immediate catalyst, and we talked about this the last time we talked about India and Pakistan, so I'm not going to go like super in depth on the history here. You can go watch that video and get the history there. But the immediate catalyst for this round of the crisis was the terrorist attacks in Pahalgam in April 22nd. This was in Indian-administered Kashmir, and it killed 26 Indian tourists. India attributed the attack to a Pakistani-based militant group, specifically Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba. And these reignited long-standing tensions over Kashmir and also with Pakistan directly. In response to this attack, India launched what it named Operation Sindoor on May 7th. And they targeted 9 locations within Pakistan-administered Kashmir, but most importantly, also within Pakistan proper. These strikes targeted infrastructure that was associated with JM and Lashkar-e-Taiba using Rafale fighter jets with Scalp missiles and AESM hammer bombs. Now, like I said, it is very important that we know that they did target areas within Pakistan proper. This is the first time since 1971 that India has done that. Pakistan condemned these strikes as an act of aggression. They claimed civilian casualties and asserted that their air defense shot down several Indian aircraft, including the Rafale jets. India initially denied these losses, but reports from U.S. officials suggest that a Pakistani-flown but Chinese-made J-10 aircraft may have downed at least 2 Indian aircraft. This incident has kind of blown up in at least fame online, especially with Pakistani officials claiming that this was the largest air battle since World War II, with over 125 aircraft taking to the air and shooting at each other over dozens of kilometers in distance. Now, that claim from Pakistani officials It has not been verified. It, to me, is probably a gross exaggeration of what really happened. But what we do know is that something happened in the air and India lost some fighter jets. That at least is clear. However, the days following these initial strikes, we saw rapid escalation between the two. Both sides began heavy artillery strikes against each other along the line of control, and that resulted in even more civilian casualties on both sides. This led to an increased pace between the two, with the tit-for-tat dynamic speeding up as the fighting had continued. And this created a really concerning dynamic where the time between each other's responses became progressively shorter. Now, as a comparison, and I talked about this a little bit on Twitter, but think of last year's strikes between Israel and Iran. There were weeks between each other's strikes on one another, and it even became a long-standing joke that, neither side was going to do anything, or that they were going to wait a year until they struck each other. But that allowed both sides' decision makers ample time to really calculate and calibrate their strikes to minimize unnecessary escalation and really more just send a political message through the strike. Now, that is not what we saw between India and Pakistan. Instead, both sides increased the speed of strikes against one another, eager to show each other just how responsive that they were and willing they were to escalate. It went from artillery strikes to drones against each other to ballistic and cruise missiles against each other, and then the ceasefire struck. But it all happened within hours of each other. This is almost a textbook example of what's referred to as an escalatory spiral, when both sides are attempting to one-up the other and force the other side to back down. Luckily, at least for now, it appears that cooler heads have prevailed. Both nations also claim cyber attacks targeting one another, with Pakistani sources claiming that they disabled 70% of India's power grid. And this hits on a major theme, and that's the media war that played out. Media outlets in both countries disseminated very conflicting reports, both claiming dramatic successes on their own side and dramatic failures on the opposite side. And this created a disinformation spiral as well online, where it became very, very difficult for those of us on the outside of the conflict looking in, and even those inside the conflict, to know exactly what was going on in reality. You would get one report that there was an attack on one city, and then immediately after a report saying that that attack did not take place. And then you would get some video, and then that video would be pulled from a completely different incident from like Israel or something. It made it very difficult to track in real time. Now, initially, international efforts to de-escalate the situation faltered. The United States expressed some concern, but then made very clear that this was not really of relevance to them and decided to sit this one out. However, things changed on May 10th whenever the United States claimed to have received very concerning intelligence without elaborating on what that intelligence was, and they claimed at least to have brokered a ceasefire between India and Pakistan. And this agreement called for the immediate halt of all actions on the land, air, and sea. While President Donald Trump announced the ceasefire, India emphasized that the truce had been agreed to bilaterally through military-to-military communications between India and Pakistan, and that the United States did not play a role in this. Both nations agreed to freeze hostilities, with senior military officials between India and Pakistan set to meet on May 12th to discuss the ceasefire status. In the aftermath of this crisis, at least where we're at right now in the ceasefire, while I'm recording this video at least, it's May 12th, both nations have crafted narratives to assert dominance and justifications for what had just happened. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi framed India's military response as a decisive act against terrorism and positioned it as a testament to India's unwavering commitment to national security. Whenever he addressed the nation, Modi lauded the armed forces for their precision strikes against terrorist infrastructure and asserted that India had sent a very clear message to its adversaries. The Indian government also emphasized that the operation was a targeted response to the Pahalgam attack and threatened Pakistan that any additional terrorist attacks would be treated as an act of war by Pakistan. Pakistan's leadership, on the other hand, portrayed its actions as a defensive measurement to protect its own sovereignty. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif condemned Indian strikes as unprovoked aggression and expressed gratitude for countries like China for their diplomatic support. The Pakistani government also reported civilian casualties as a result from India's operations, and they emphasized this cost and created a rallying around the flag kind of effect for Pakistan and drove more nationalistic sentiment against India. Pakistan's military also claims to have downed several Indian aircraft, though again, these claims have yet to be independently verified, but we have seen evidence of at least part of this claim being somewhat true. In effect, both sides have been claiming victory from this crisis. To India, they responded boldly to terrorism. They taught Pakistan Pakistan a lesson, and they even withheld some of their strength. To Pakistan, they demonstrated that they had defended their sovereignty against India while bloodying India's nose and preventing India from launching further attacks while compelling them to halt their attacks in the future. So what did anybody actually gain from all of this? Well, let's look at the gains and the losses for both sides. For India, India gained swift execution of Operation Sindoor and targeted terrorist infrastructure in Pakistan. This, in effect, also bolstered and reinforced Narendra Modi's political position and reinforces political image as a decisive leader. It also drummed up nationalistic sentiment within India against Pakistan, and that distracts from some relatively controversial political decisions within India that are going on right now. In terms of losses, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what the tactical impact from either side of this crisis was. Both sides are releasing a lot of satellite imagery showing the different strikes on each other's infrastructure, and a lot of the imagery really appears fairly inconclusive. However, it is clear that India has faced some pretty significant costs already. The Indian Air Force did themselves report the loss of 3 aircraft during the conflict, including Rafale fighter jets and an Su-30. And these are the first combat losses of Rafale fighter jets. This crisis also led to immediate economic repercussions for the Indian economy, with Indian markets experiencing a lot of investor wealth loss due to heightened security risks. For Pakistan, Pakistan's leadership gained from its framed responses as a defense of national sovereignty and rallying around the flag effectively for domestic support. Again, the Pakistani Prime Minister thanked the armed forces and declared a national Thanksgiving Day to emphasize appreciation for the Army's capabilities and to boost morale within the country. In terms of losses to them, though, the conflict did result in some additional civilian casualties, and that's true for India as well. However, there's also a key development that is going to be a very important thing that we're going to have to track moving forward. India stated formally a new policy that any terrorist attack originating from Pakistan on India would be viewed as a formal act of war by the Pakistan government, and that would be responded to very directly and aggressively by India in the future. I think that this is the real loss for Pakistan here. In effect, India is forcing Pakistan's hand with Pakistan-based terror groups. Note that Pakistan already has a very hard time controlling these groups, but there's also speculation, not only among Indians, but well beyond Pakistan and India, that Pakistani intelligence, the ISI, is behind some of these groups, providing direct or indirect support. By viewing terror attacks from Pakistan as an act of war, India is forcing Pakistan to rectify this issue. Either if Pakistan is supporting these groups, then they have to cut that support and dismantle them, something that is way easier said than done. Or if Pakistan is not supporting these groups, then they're going to have to combat them directly to dismantle them, and that will not be easy. In either case, for Pakistan to act on this, it would be an implicit admission that it is incapable of defending itself from India, and that it feels that it has to take these steps, otherwise it is risking an Indian response that it feels it can't defend itself against. So if it does nothing, then it does risk future terrorist attacks, which could risk another war with India. So while Pakistan is claiming victory publicly, behind the scenes there's very likely some consternation around this new Indian policy, and Pakistan is going to have to make some very difficult decisions here in the very near future if they want to avoid another crisis with India like what we just saw, or potentially worse. Now, next, I'd also add in China as a potential winner in this conflict. China maintained a neutral stance publicly, but they did urge restraint, and they got to get kind of involved in this a little bit diplomatically, though not significantly. We haven't really seen China get involved in foreign issues the way that like the United States or Russia has in the past, and this is kind of another case where that's happened. However, it did show that military hardware provided by China to Pakistan has proven effective. And this might boost sales for Chinese-made systems, especially their J-10 aircraft and other kinds of air-to-air missiles. So despite the ceasefire, the conflict has only intensified the decades-long struggle over Kashmir. Both India and Pakistan have moved significant military forces towards the border and towards the region, which has turned Kashmir into one of the most militarized zones in the world. The civilian population in the area bore the brunt of the escalation, and they will bear the brunt of it in the future as well if it does escalate, with regular crossfire and artillery exchanges disrupting daily life and causing casualties. Politically, the positions on both sides appear to have hardened. India has become emboldened by Operation Sindoor and has reiterated that terrorism originating from Pakistan will be treated as an act of war. Pakistan has insisted that it will never abandon Kashmir and has framed it as a central issue for their national identity and security. This stalemate around Kashmir will continue regardless of the ceasefire. This is just another chapter in this longer issue. And this crisis did not create any new room for more diplomatic efforts or any kind of meaningful negotiation to handle Kashmir in the future or provide any kind of a resolution. However, the good news here is that the conflict, while it was intense, it did not cross the nuclear threshold, but there are things to discuss on this issue. It did expose how fragile this status is and how nuclear deterrence can very much become an exercise of nuclear deterrence, which nobody wants. The concern here is that if this kind of thing becomes normalized, a direct conflict between two nuclear-armed states that does not result in a nuclear exchange, then that could lead to additional conflicts between other nuclear-armed states that not only risks nuclear annihilation, but becomes just more common in general, and altogether way more destructive, even from a conventional standpoint. Now, I want to take this time to note that there were earthquakes reported in western Pakistan during this entire crisis, and even as recent as today, the day I'm recording on May 12th. But I want to know that this is an area where earthquakes do happen incredibly frequently, and I think that they may very well have just been natural earthquakes. However, even the chance that these were not natural earthquakes, especially as they were kind of coinciding with this crisis, and instead that these were nuclear tests, and again, I've seen no evidence that these were nuclear tests, but just the idea that might have been enough to have spooked the United States to get involved in trying to broker something between the two and have gotten India and Pakistan to talk to each other and agree to a ceasefire. Even if these earthquakes were totally natural, the fear and uncertainty that they were not unnatural may have been more than enough to spur some people into action. I will say that since all this stopped, there have been earthquakes that have occurred further north in the Himalayas and within Afghanistan. Again, totally normal in this part of the world for Earth to just do Earth things. If they were natural and they struck during the height of the fighting and that's just kind of by coincidence, then consider it an act of God that pulled us from the brink. If they weren't natural, then that definitely goes to show just how close we came to witnessing the second limited nuclear war in history, or potentially much worse. And this is not just hyperbole. Trump said as much in a speech on May 12th in the White House, answering a question about the conflict and a ceasefire. He stated that the U.S. intervention in negotiations prevented a nuclear war. Now, it is Trump. He tends to say things and he tends to exaggerate. But I don't think anybody that was watching this conflict play out live and knew what was going on has any doubts that this thing could have gone nuclear if a ceasefire had not been agreed to very quickly. So is all of this really over? Well, I would not say so, no. Both sides appear to believe that they achieved something. Even more critically, both sides' populations believe that they achieved something. Cooler heads may have prevailed at the top, but they're ultimately responsible for the people. And if the people feel threatened and feel that their leadership is not doing enough to prevent that kind of threat, then it's not uncommon for there to be changes in leadership, whether through elections or other forms of pressure. This situation may create an environment that could lead to more hardline figures in power on either side, and more moderate figures being sidelined. In the meantime, both sides will likely continue their boisterous rhetoric against one another, even if anything just to satisfy their domestic political needs. But in the end, what does any of this actually accomplish? All of this does is fuel people's desire to fight while not actually changing the conditions on the ground that created this entire situation in the first place, and that is the dispute over Kashmir. Neither side appears willing to back down even after all that we just saw. And this is the exact same as when the fighting was heaviest. It does appear like both sides are taking the ceasefire as a real opportunity to work things out. However, until an actual hard diplomatic agreement is made, and until they both deal with the increasing levels of nationalistic rhetoric, this will not be over. And it also won't be over until Pakistan does deal with the terrorist groups within their own country. Or at the very least, show India some semblance of effort that India feels satisfied with. India can always move the goalposts, though, so that it's really hard to tell whether or not that will bring an end to this situation. Whether or not India will just continue to use that situation as a scapegoat for cover against more actions against Pakistan, that's really just something that we're going to have to learn over time. On May 12th, Prime Minister Modi did say in another speech that Operation Sindoor had been paused but was not over. Diplomatic talks might lead to this operation being ended diplomatically, but that definitely does show just how clear things are that it is not over yet, and that even he does not view things as over. He also reiterated that Pakistan has to dismantle the terrorist infrastructure within the country. So again, reiterating that this is the new agreement between the two countries, even if Pakistan themselves don't necessarily agree, this is something that India is appearing to try to impose upon them, under threat of renewing the fighting. In either case, this could have gotten much, much worse than it actually did so far, but it still has the capacity to get much, much worse if a ceasefire breaks down. And even if you're an American, this still impacts us because it impacts everybody if it goes nuclear. Apart from the mass loss of human life on both sides, fallout does travel, and that impacts not only the air that we breathe, but the water that we drink. There's no world in which a nuclear exchange is acceptable for anybody, which is why the US needs to be playing a larger role in preventing this conflict from going hot again. Now, what that agreement would look like, or what that kind of arrangement would look like, I think that's a good question. Neither side appears willing to budge, and what happens whenever two sides don't want to budge on a policy position that has previously led to heart wars? Well, they tend to fight again and compel each other to move on their position. That's kind of what we're seeing between Russia and Ukraine right now, just as another example. So that is all very cheerful news, so here's a puppy. Comment what you think could come next in this crisis, and whether you think anybody actually won anything or if everybody lost, because it sure looks like everybody lost. Like this video if you found it helpful or interesting, and share it with a friend that also might. Subscribe for more content, and do join the Patreon for more analysis, not only on this conflict, but on other conflicts around the world and other international affairs issues. With all that, I'll see y'all next time. Later.